Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me from the back? Yes? Good. All right. So, as always, it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, Franklin. Thank you, IMANI, for inviting me to share some thoughts on the energy sector in Ghana. And by that, I mean just talking about the oil and gas sector, and then talking about the power sector as well. Before I go into the nitty-gritty of the presentation, just want to reiterate some quick points. First one being that, Franklin, as you rightly pointed out, my association with IMANI goes all the way back to 2009, and in the years afterwards, I remember at the height of Dumso in 2014, we did one interesting paper looking at the power sector in Ghana. And off the back of that, a number of the recommendations that we made, some were taken on board, others too are still yet to be fully implemented. But it's great to be here nonetheless, and it's actually great to be here amongst a company of friends. And I am hoping that the discussion would not be too technical. In fact, most of the slides that I have prepared are not exactly technical, because there's no point, going through some of the nitty-gritty technical stuff, given the audience that we have. But also amongst friends, in the sense that I see there's the Dundee and the Aberdeen connection in here. So, and there's a bit of a rivalry between Aberdeen and Dundee. So, I kept hearing Dundee and I was shaking my head a little bit. But it's still all good. Finally, I must also commend the work that the many CSOs are doing in this sector. But for the CSOs pushing or driving some of the agenda and engaging governments at that high level on some of the nitty-gritty issues, I doubt we would have made the progress that we're making currently in the energy sector in Ghana. So special commendation, I think, would have to go to ASEP, to IMANI, to GOGEC, to NRGI, to even PIAC, which is the government, quasi body which is responsible for ensuring that oil revenues are accurately and effectively utilized. I just came back 2 days ago. There was a discussion that I partook in the House of Commons in London, and it really revolved around some of these issues around energy access, energy affordability, resource management, and how countries like Ghana could effectively utilize their oil and gas resources. So today I want to walk you through a number of things, looking at the future of Ghana's energy supply or industry. But the twist that I have given to it is, how do we avoid some of the surprises that we saw, particularly in the last 5 years, with Dumso lasting from 2014 right through to the latter part of 2016, or you could even argue mid-2017. My background is in energy economics. I do a lot of work in this sector, but then I also do the interesting political dimension to how these resources are utilized. So for today's talk, I will focus on two big thematic questions. And the big thematic questions are split into a number of points. I don't want to belabor and go through all of this, but the key thing I want us to take home at the end of this discussion and the conversations with the panel as well, really would be, given where we are with our oil and gas industry since 2010, December of 2010, when we started production, how do we take the industry to the next phase of development? But more importantly, how do we situate that, or how do we bring a align GMPC's role within the context of this evolving industry? And when we look at the sectoral issues around local content, revenue management, and then integrating the oil and gas industry into the wider economy, what are some of the potential pitfalls that we've observed in the last 7 years, and going forward, how do we put in place plans, policies, measures to address them. In the power sector, and it ties into the oil and gas sector, again, the focus really is around energy supply, energy access. I will talk a lot more about gas supply and LNG imports. I'll talk about market reform, and then tie that in with the bit about the whole brouhaha, for want of a better word, around the ECG privatization and what that actually means for the economy going forward. So what's the context to all of this discussion? And the context of this discussion arises from the surprises that we've witnessed over the last 3 years. So on the slide here, you could actually see in the bottom right-hand corner, Ghana's GDP growth rate over past 8 years. But we could see the impact that Doomsor particularly had from 2014, 15, 16, where at one point, growth percent at the height of the oil boom started dwindling. We had Doomsor 14, 15, 16, and just about 2017, 18 going forward, we've seen an increase or an uptick in activity. It's important to note here, though, that all the improvement that we've seen in economic growth rates starting from 2017 could also be attributed as a lag effect. So some of the structural policies that were undertaken in 15 and 16 actually translated into the GDP growth numbers that we're seeing in 2017 and going forward in 2018, 19. It's not an instantaneous or something that actually took place overnight. It goes back or transcends a number of policies that have been done by various governments. But this growth has been underpinned by a number of things. So we've seen a lot of increasing demand for Ghana's natural resources, particularly gold and then oil output. But we've seen improvements in Ghana's overall governance and macroeconomic indicators. And then the increase in rapid urbanization and domestic demand all partly contribute to what we're witnessing in the next, what we're seeing in 2017 and going forward into 2018-19. The medium-term outlook in terms of the economy for Ghana really is one in which, if the current policies and measures are sustained, we are looking at a region of between 7 and 8.5% growth rate consistently over the next 5 to 10 years. But what that really means for the oil sector in terms of this context really is that for the oil sector, or the growth that we have seen in the last 7-8 years, I mentioned has been driven predominantly by natural resource exports, particularly cocoa and then also oil. And with regards to oil, typically you look at some sort of value creation framework. And for a lot of governments that I have worked with in a private consulting capacity, they're often interested in a number of things. They're interested in the taxes or the revenues that come from the production, but they're interested in the economics spin-offs in the sense that you're looking at how skills are developed working with different partners and the supply chain. They look at how you can grow indigenous Ghanaian companies that have the specialist expertise to service the industry locally, but also regionally, and how you bring that integrated workforce and specialists as an export opportunity. This is not particularly targeted at Ghana as a whole, but these are the sort of questions that often governments would be looking at in terms of how to actually take advantage of the opportunities that are prevalent within the life cycle of an oil and gas project. However, since 2015, when we saw oil and gas prices starting to decline on the global level, we've seen that having a big impact on investment across the world, and Ghana being one of them as well, which has thrown a lot of the opportunities that government potentially are looking at in terms of getting the spin-offs into a bit of off gear. But that's within the context, in the Ghanaian case, of a number of things having taken place in the oil and gas industry. So on the slide here, what I've done is really to map out the key milestones that have taken place in Ghana's oil and gas industry since 2004, when the first new contracts were signed. But the thing to really observe in all of this is within the period 2011 to 2014, after we started first production from 2010, a number of institutional regulatory frameworks have been set up, and that includes, the Petroleum Commission Act. We've seen the Revenue Management Act and its amendment. We've seen the local content regulations also subsequently being passed, and we've seen PIAC being set up under the PRMA to do its work of revenue accountability in the sector. But post 2014, we saw oil prices going down, and that significantly had an impact on Ghana's economy. I remember very well when the 2015 budget was presented, the government made an assumption, an oil price assumption of $99.38 per barrel. And they were expecting to get in excess of $1 billion USD of revenues coming in that particular fiscal year. However, in July of the same year, the then finance minister actually went to Parliament with a supplementary budget on the basis of having to actually revise the numbers, because price had gone down to well below $40 a barrel. And that then meant that the budget of 1 billion of oil revenues coming in had to be substantially reduced to below, I think it was below 400 million USD. But it just shows you the extent to which, Ghana's economy, in the absence of the diversification that we all talk about, is still fairly dependent on 3 or 4 key commodity exports, and to the extent that these external macro shocks, impact or filter through on the economy, we would find ourselves consistently, fighting to save the situation, and a lot of surprises being coming up going forward. What this shows you, it's a bit of an odd graph, but what this shows you really is how the sector is organized overall. So on one end, you've got the different political parties, and here I just put in the NPP because they are the government in power. And then you have the pressure groups, the civil society organizations trying to influence government policy, and that filters through to the various organizations that are involved with regulating the sector, and then further down to the component bit. But what I'm going to focus on in the next few slides is really look at the oil sector, and then after I make the point, I'll move to talk about the energy sector and then the issues therein. A point to note here really is that there are some solutions that I propose. However, it's much more, I want this to be much more of a discussive element, in the sense that we throw out the issues and then we think around them to see what could possibly be done. So nothing here is exactly cast or fixed in stone. So I talked about the oil industry, the impact that the decline in prices have had on the economy as a whole. But when you look at even current government policy objectives, you could actually see that a number of the pledges that have been made, such as one district, one factory, free secondary school, 1 million per constituency, all these are actually anchored on the government getting oil and gas output increasing, and by that I mean getting production well in excess of 200,000 barrels a day. Currently, we're doing just around 165,000 barrels a day, but when you tally up the existing fields that we have, Jubilee, keep 3 points, and then you tally up 10, you could see that we are very likely to actually hit this 200,000 barrel a day target by about 2020. But that is only one small part of the story, in the sense that yes, we can get this increased production coming through, but oil prices are not dictated by the government. They are more driven by what happens at the external market conditions. The point here being that if we really want to meet the key government objectives or the pledges, around the social issues, but also around the economic issues, such as free SHS, which is being proposed to be funded from the ABFA amount under the PRMA, then we'll have to get production increasing, and then hope or hedge and expect oil prices to also stay up within a much more reasonable limit. Minor small point to note here is when you even look at the 1 million USD that is being proposed to be given to the constituencies under the, I think, Infrastructure for Poverty and something IPEP. When you add them up over 4 years, that comes up to 1.1 billion, and in current terms, that's about 2.5% of Ghana's GDP, and that's not chicken change. It's quite a lot of money that is at stake here, and so it's vitally important that we, as civil society organizations, but also as people who are interested in the sector, get to ask the right sort of questions around how these monies, would potentially be utilized. To hit the production targets that I've shown on the chart on the right, a number of things need to be done. The government does not have the resources, the financial resources, to commit to a huge exploration project and development programs that need to get the oil and gas resources off the ground. And so ordinarily you would expect international investors to come in to support the government to do that. And to do that, some factors do affect how the investment decision making is made. So here what I've shown really is the factors can be broadly categorized into two parts. The first part as what is below ground factors, and I'll go into that in the next few slides. But what I want to highlight is things around the fiscal, the contracting element in the petroleum agreement, but then also the prospectivity and then the acreage that is widely or would be available for these IOCs to come in and explore for oil and gas resources in the country. Within the above ground factors, there are issues around the overall cost environment within the country, but externally as well. And then you look at things around market access and then infrastructure. So for example, if one were to discover another huge gas field or resources, is there the readily available pipelines that can evacuate the gas from offshore, onshore, or even reprocess them into LNG, even offshore, and take them to some of the markets that are needed. And then the last point here is around the political risk, the business environment. People coming in, do they feel safe with their investment? Can they repatriate the monies that they've made out of the country? Are there labor-related issues? Are there operational issues? Are there potential threats to property, vandalism, terrorism? All those make up the composite bit around the political or country political risk. But for a typical IOC coming into a country, this is the sort of matrix that they would employ in arriving at a decision on whether to invest in country A or to invest in country B. So Ghana is competing for petrodollars from all over the world. And some other countries, for example, in Guyana, where I've been doing some work in the last 6 months, have huge resources. By that I mean you're looking at in excess of potentially 15 billion barrels of oil. And these IOCs, much as they have the cash, are also looking at getting a fair return on their investment. So Ghana is certainly competing with the likes of Guyana, or even next door in Cote d'Ivoire or Angola or Nigeria in terms of attracting these investments. And therefore what that means is that going forward, we have to focus on revamping oil and gas exploration activity. Part of the reason why activity levels have stalled in the industry across the board, but in Ghana, is we had the low oil prices that I mentioned. We had capital rationing with the companies scaling back and wanting to look at the projects that offer a much more prospective return on the investment. But then we also had the issue with the maritime border between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. That luckily was resolved in Ghana's favor. But what has happened is, since we signed the contract in 2004, on the chart on my right-hand side, you can see all the exploration and production wells that have been drilled by the different IOCs. And you can see the impact that the low oil prices has had. So from 2015-16, we really didn't drill any new particular well in the sector. And going forward, I think that we've got to get the wells, the drilling more new wells coming up in order to sustain the output levels, because that ultimately is what would feed through government revenues and the ability for government to actually meet all these big promises and pledges that they're making, and will continue to make as is expected of government. And so to do that, there's been the new Exploration and Production Act that was passed in 2016 that is intending to shift from the current open door policy where anybody could actually walk into the ministry on the basis of proposal to get an oil block to prospect for, to move into this competitive auctions or public tendering approach. Although we have seen, despite the existence of the Act, we've seen some new contracts that have been signed, by that I mean the Exxon contract that was still signed on the basis of direct negotiations with the government. I think some of the CSOs have raised questions or issues around that, but the impression that I get is actually a story that I read just last week was that Ghana is looking forward to starting its own the first licensing round in the latter part of 2018. So it'll be interesting to see within the licensing round what sort of technical parameters, biddable parameters that the companies coming in or wanting to invest would want to work on. In addition to that, to revamping the E&A activity, there's an intention to provide a number of fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. I will go much more in depth in the next few slides, but the target here is the government says that they want to get larger IOCs to compete in the sector. And it's driven in part by the fact that between 2012 and 2015, a number of new petroleum agreements were signed. Some of them in one particular period in 2016, I think Ben, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the government back then sent 4 new agreements under a certificate of emergency to, was passed under, was 8 actually, yes, under a certificate of emergency in Parliament. And the issues then were around, the capability of these IOCs, coming in to actually do the work, because most of them were fairly small, nondescript companies, and we didn't even know, who the owners of those companies were. So the current focus is really to get some of the larger IOCs coming into the sector, off the back of the issue of de-risking of the Western Petroleum Basin. So you could see with the ENA Act being passed, with stalled, exploration levels, we've seen in the last just this year, 2 interesting developments in the sector. So we've seen the Exxon acquiring this new exploration acreage in the deep water tunnel contract area. And then we've also seen Aca buying into Hess's acreage within that same vicinity. But this has been done in response to what I mentioned earlier about the maritime border being delimited now. So what had happened was Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana they made competing claims. But in the Ivorian case, in the submissions that they made to the International Tribunal for the Law of Sea, the Ivorians were claiming this bit, all of this bit of Ghana's basin as theirs, which then meant that these blocks, the AGM, the Hess, and even part of the 10 block was affected at one particular point, which led Talu to suspend 10 new wells that they actually wanted to drill on the 10 development in 2015, 16, 17. But with the delimitation of the border now and the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone, we've seen renewed interest in upstream oil and gas activity levels in the sector. But the other interesting question which I have at the back of my mind and not being fully formed is, what kind of acreage areas would the government potentially be looking at giving out in the upcoming licensing round? And it's also interesting with the fact, again, that in the new contracts that were signed in between 2012 and 2015, some of them have the first exploration period is actually coming up for renewal. So when the contract is signed, you would have an exploration period typically of 7 to 8 years, but it's divided into three or 2 sub-periods. And in the first period, lasting 3 to 4 years, the IOC coming in has to either acquire so many kilometers of seismic 3D or drill one wildcat well or meet certain performance obligations. And these new contracts that were signed, a lot of them actually are coming up for renewal in terms of the work that they've done within the first exploration period. So I'm just wondering, and again I have no answers to this, what would inform the acreage policy that the government will actually use in giving out licenses in the upcoming new or the very new licensing round that they want to undertake. So again, what I'm showing here is, despite this renewed interest in the sector and the improving environment, there's still some issues that need to be addressed. So here, these are the challenges that I have listed, and then I'll talk about some of the solutions or policy proposals that can be done. So overall, Ghana actually doesn't fare too badly when you look at how its petroleum policy environment and competitive environment fares with other jurisdictions in the world. So if you look at the latest NRGI index that was recently launched for last year, Ghana ranks 13th out of 89 countries across the world when it comes to resource management. And then on the Petroleum Policy Perception Index that's published by the Fraser Institute, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're actually number 3 next to Namibia and South Africa when it comes to the overall policy environment. But nonetheless, there's still issues that need to be addressed. And I'll quickly run through them. The first one being around licensing, which I've talked about briefly, that we still don't have clarity around the licensing criteria and the parameters that we use to assess the bids. When it comes to local content, we still have issues with a number of the supply chain companies complaining that they're struggling to meet some of the restrictive content obligations. And interestingly, the the ENP law mandates that in any new contract that is signed, 5% of the equity within the license has to go to a local partner. And in the Exxon contract that was signed recently, they still haven't found a local partner to give this 5% equity in the license to. There's some thoughts going around that, but I suspect that if after a period of time they're unable to find a local partner who has the financial resources to commit to 5% equity in the license, then this 5% may very well revert or go back to GMPC, because GMPC by law has the right to acquire this additional interest. On the fiscal regime element, I've done extensive work on this, and consistently when you benchmark Ghana's petroleum fiscal or tax regime against others, we're fairly favorable. However, we're seeing that when you take a look at the resource rent windfall tax component of it, it still discriminates between even the same petroleum agreement for similar levels of geological risk. So you could take one agreement that is within the same sort of vicinity in terms of the block, but when you test it out against different sizes of oil fields, different costs, and you run through the whole analysis, you still find out that when it comes to the windfall tax component of that, there's still some discrimination between some of the petroleum agreements. And at the institutional level, this is something that consistently comes up in a lot of the work that I do, that some sort of overlapping mandate between some of the government agencies when it comes to compliance and monitoring, and even the framework for private investment when it comes to gas, gas to power, again, is still fairly insufficient. So you could see it's a bit difficult to read this, but the point here is that since the Jubilee contract, since the Cosmos contract was signed in 2004, right through to the successive contract that have been signed, the fiscal terms have improved. So we're looking at royalty rates of 4-5%. Now you're looking at royalty rates of about 12.5% in some contracts, but on average you're looking at about 8% royalty on some of the contracts. And then things around GMPC's participation interest also have also improved as and when these new contracts have been signed. I want to touch on GMPC's role, and then I'll tie it in with my point on the oil and gas sector in general, and then move into the petroleum, into the power sector. So GMPC's role is quite critical in all of this going forward, and particularly with regard to its management or relationship with the IOCs. So typically, we need to understand the extent of where a country would lies within its political economy spectrum. And then we need to align that with the type of national oil company that we want. So as we speak currently, Ghana is more sort of, an allocation state. By that I mean there's still large windfall profits that come from oil and gas resources, and it's still not fairly or evenly distributed with regards to the fact that the politicians still control the pot with regards to how these monies are utilized. And then when you look at how the state is, we say we want to move from this allocation state to one that is industrializing. However, when you look at GMPC in terms of its typology, you can see that GMPC is still fairly more of statist bureaucracy. So you still have extensive government control over GNPC's operations, and if we want to move GNPC to play a much more increasing role from a statist bureaucracy to a development bureaucracy, then that cannot be done on its own. It has to be done in tandem with moving the state also as well from an allocation state towards an industrializing state. Else, there's still going to be the odd issues that we've seen where GNPC at one particular point was providing letters of credit, to support power purchase agreements that deviates from its core mandate. And I'll move into that where, if you look at GNPC, just like some of the state-owned enterprises we have, it's, for want of a better word, it's a large monster. So, GNPC has many subsidiaries and joint ventures. And the core mandate of GNPC, according to the PNDC Law 64, is that it needs to undertake exploration, development, production, and disposal of petroleum. But when you look at GNPC currently in terms of its structure, GNPC is into mining, GNPC is into telecom, GNPC is into hospitality, and GNPC is even into farms. It's got equity stake in Valley Farms. And I keep asking myself, for the EMP bit and then for the gas bit where it has all these, entities within it, do we, I don't know the answer to this, but do we really need all these extra components in terms of GNPC's activities and align it to its core mandate, of undertaking EMP production and then disposal of petroleum? GNPC responds to a number of institutions in terms of its performance monitoring, Parliament, the Ministry, and the State Enterprises Commission. The issue I find often is that beyond these three sort of institutions, the the National Oil Company doesn't seem, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, doesn't seem to be engaging much with the civil society organizations. It's sometimes quite difficult if you want to, find information, on GNPC's activities. It had to take some of us to actually push and agitate for GNPC to change its website, and then number two, to make its financials available on its website and then on the website of the Ministry of Finance. But I'm hoping that going forward, some of these things will now become much more mainstream. On local content, how many more minutes have I got? Sorry, but there's a lot of detail on the slides, and the oil and gas sector is one. Sure. All right. Thank you. So on local content, Ernst & Young actually did some interesting work last year, where they looked at the capacity of the different strands of companies within the sector to respond to the changing needs of the industry. So on here, I took this from the presentation that they made. So you see the capacity of local suppliers on this axis here, from low to high, and then you see the amount of projected industry spend. That's the size of the pie or the pot or the cake between 2014 to 2024. These bubbles represent the size of the different size of the pie. But what I want to mention is that whereas we have some high quality capacity within things like IT and communication and transportation and supply and disposal of petroleum products or services in the industry, this is really not where the money is. If you really want to capture a lot of the value, then we've got to move the policy framework and the plans that we pursue within the next 5 to 10 years has to be geared towards moving us to capturing a lot more of the value in things like well drilling, in fabrication, in procurement, and then in feed design, and then linking that to R&D and the capacity of the local universities that we have to undertake critical R&D activity. So I keep hearing a lot of talk about local content, and some figures are bandied about, which creates an impression that we're doing fairly well within the local content space. But what I propose here is a much more nuanced view, in the sense that yes, we'll have one or two companies that are doing okay, but if we want to capture much more value, we need to move towards the well drilling and things like fabrication and construction. And then touching on petroleum revenue management, I did some work for PIAC last year. So we did some work for PIAC. This is a company I work with called Petrol Consult Africa, where we looked at the PIAC framework for petroleum resource management, the law for petroleum revenue management, and PIAC's role within all of that. So this chart here shows you the big document on the PRMA. That's all condensed into these component parts, where the revenues go into the fund, and then part of that is used to support GMPC's activities. The rest into the ABFA, and the remainder goes to the petroleum funds. And there's even a mention within the Act on exceptional purposes and transfers. This is quite an interesting bit. When you read the portion of the Act that deals with this, it talks about that monies in the Petroleum Holding Fund could also be used to support communities. So for example, if there was an oil spill and it came to impact the livelihoods of people living in these communities, then you could take some of the monies from this fund, to support exceptional purposes. But predominantly, all the revenues that we've had has gone towards these three key elements. And the question, Franklin, as you mentioned, is the revenues have been spread too thinly. Some of the projects in it, PIAC's report that they released 2 or 3 weeks ago, they went on various visits to some parts of the northern region. And in one particular place that they went, some of the projects that were reported to have been done actually were not done. And I think civil society they're doing what they can, but I think we can push a lot more when it comes to some of the revenue monitoring aspects of the PRMA. But also PIAC now, I was discussing with them that, if it could have some sort of prosecutorial powers to, chase up on some of these projects, then maybe it will go a long way to ensure that we're doing right on how we manage our revenues. So to sum all of this up in terms of recommendations, I've got a couple of points here, the forward outlook. So we need to establish competitive, bidding round for competitive bidding for a licensing round. That's already been given within the new Exploration and Production Act, but we need clarity on the bidding and the evaluation parameters, and that needs to be published, and it needs to be accessible to all companies that want to come and participate in the sector. But we also have to find a way of supporting local companies to form JVs and consortiums so they can take that 5% equity in the block. On the fiscal regime, we've got to move towards drafting a new model petroleum agreement. So the existing model agreement that we have, which we use for negotiations, goes all the way back to 2002. There's even versions that go back to 2000. However, but given the changes within the E&P law, we need to ensure that the new model agreement, which will be the basis for negotiation for the new licensing round, aligns with the E&P law, and then even things like the petroleum income tax law, and with clarity around the ring fencing provisions and then the loss carried forward. By that I mean, when a company makes a loss or they drill for oil and gas resources and they make a loss this year, they can carry those losses forward until the point where they make a positive return on their cash flow. But there's still not a lot of clarity around some of these critical bits, because you potentially have issues there around things to do with transfer pricing and cross-border, financial flows. Don't forget that these companies are multinational entities, and there are clever accounting, rules and means that sometimes, they could adopt. But in the absence of us, providing that clarity, we might be giving unnecessary revenues, away, which could be used to support the government's development agenda. I always say, it's easy to discredit 50,000 USD, as money that's lost here. But 50,000 USD can very well build a 6-unit classroom block in my village at Acheampong in the central region. Then we resolve the issues of the maritime border. So we still have an existing maritime border demarcation issue with Togo that has not been resolved. So that needs to be a priority concern for us, but we have to take the lessons from the Ghana-Cote d'Ivoire maritime border issue. Interestingly, when the debate was going on within the court, the Togolese actually sent a delegation all the way to Hamburg to follow through with all the proceedings that were taking place. Institutionally, a number of things that need to be done. We've got to develop sector-specific regulations, and here I concede to the fact that some draft of these regulations are being done. So some work is already going on in this place, but we need to fast-track that against the backdrop of the fact that we want to have a new licensing round in this year. On local content, and this is something that is at the heart, at my own personal interest and heart, we can develop some of these strategic capacity development programs. Two very good examples come from Angola and Brazil. And what I would advise, possibly the government, but particularly the GNPC and the Petroleum Commission to come up with is a roadmap on how we're actually going to ensure that come 2024, we can move, or we would have moved from some of the low value additive sectors to things like feed and well engineering and design. And then things around infrastructure access to markets. I'll quickly rush through, because I think I'm going through. I'll quickly rush through the power sector. This is on the oil and gas sector. I'll quickly rush through the power sector and discuss one or two of the issues in the power sector. So remember this slide that I showed you earlier on, where I'm going to focus now more on is the power sector and the linkage between the power sector and then the upstream, oil and gas sector. I'm sure many of you remember this, the famous Doom Summer Stop demonstration. This was 2015 or 16? 2015, yes, where many Ghanaians, took to the streets against the government of the day to say they had enough with persistent power crisis. But the impact of that, as I showed in the slides way before, was on the economy. And you could see this, we've got 67% of the rural population still being connected to the grid. Actually, Ghana, next to South Africa, are the two countries in all of Sub-Saharan Africa that have these higher levels of electrification rate in excess of 80%. If you look at Sierra Leone in Liberia, they are below 20%, but particularly because of the issues with the war and political instability, which had an impact on that. So we have moved from 20-30% electrification rate. Now we're sitting just a little around. We've moved. That's the urban years, the population here. So we've moved just a little over 70%. The current figure is actually around 80%. However, we're still not, generating enough power in terms of the intensity to drive industry forward. So if you look at the East Asian and the Pacific countries, in terms of the power that they consume per every capita of GDP output. This is where they fare. When you look at Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, and all of sub-Saharan Africa, if we really want to leapfrog and catch up with these guys, then this is the size of the gap that we've got to address. And it's by no means an easy challenge. These things will take some kind of years to come up with. So we've had crisis upon crisis, and the government response to many of these crises has been liberalizing the market, introducing some of the demand-side load management, by energy efficiency. So in the 2006-2007 crisis that we have, the Kufuor government, I do recall, they replaced all the incandescent bulbs with LED or CFLs, and that was able to save part of the energy that would have ordinarily been used. And then even when we had the recent crisis as well, similar measures were introduced by the government of the day. And we've had expansion of the grid to various communities. What we haven't done though, or what we haven't done too greatly on, is improving the capacity expansion. And this is more historical than recent underpinnings. So we've signed all these power purchase agreements, but that has been more of a knee-jerk reaction to the crisis than the initial forward planning that would have been needed. So currently, the generation mix is really coming from more of thermal power and then hydro, because historically hydro has been fairly unreliable. But the interesting thing I see consistently is we talk about we want to increase renewable energy in the total energy mix. And back 10 years ago, there was a target to get 10% of the energy mix coming from renewable sources by 2020. We're in 2018. And as I speak to you now, the total renewable energy component of our energy mix is actually less than 1%. In reality, it's actually 0.25 something percent of the total energy mix. So the big policy talks is one thing. Translating that into actual investment, and regulatory environment that supports the uptake of renewables is another thing altogether. I will quickly skip over that. But when we've had these crises upon crisis, we go in and sign these power purchase agreements, or bring in IPPs who sign a power purchase agreement with the government. But typically you have an IPP who would have to sign a PPA with the likes of ECG or any downstream company. And then you might have some sort of implementation agreement between the company and the government, sometimes even providing the sovereign guarantee for that. And then there's a relationship between the IPP and then the financiers, either locally, externally, or in some instances, if it's at the multilateral level, the financiers or the lenders might be engaging directly with the government. This structure has been what we've adopted in attempting to respond to the issue of power crisis and insufficient energy generation capacity. But it's driven by many types of risks that consistently feature, whether you're looking at Ghana or Rwanda or Malawi, and I've listed some of them here. But you can broadly categorize them across three strands, from political to economic to social. On the political bit, things around government instability. On the economic bit, we're looking at things like inability to recover the cost of generation, because the current tariff structure does not generate or guarantee a return on investment for the IPPs. In the absence, of new generation capacity coming on, and with all the new PPAs that we've signed, gas is going to play a significant role in Ghana's energy sector going forward, because the thermal generation component is forecasted to rise from the current 57 to about 65, sometimes 70% in the medium-term outlook. And so it means we need a lot of gas to fuel the plants. We have significant gas discoveries that we've made domestically, and that will be able to actually meet our base case demand for power in the past. And historically, of course, we wanted to, the plan was to meet the deficit by importing gas from Nigeria, but we know the age-old issues with the West African gas pipeline and its inability to meet the contractual volumes. In getting the gas to come on stream, I mentioned that in the base case scenario, the domestic gas resources that we have from 10, Jubilee and Sankofa can meet the power generation deficit that we need. However, in the medium term, from the mid-2020s, we would have to consider potentially, LNG imports. And this is an interesting area that I also find that there are about 3 separate proposals on the table with regards to LNG, where government is working with these companies that I've listed above. But it was late last year, early this year, which we heard that there was a new potential agreement between GNPC and Gazprom. And from a political risk sort of contractual lens point of view, I was just really wondering, that if we've got these Quantum and then the Sahara projects coming on stream, and we're bringing the Gazprom other one also on stream, potentially we could be looking at some oversupply or overcapacity issues in the market. And these contracts would have things, they'll have elements to do with capacity charges that would have to pay. And so we would have to potentially streamline these projects, the timing in terms of when they come on stream. This is the experience I have seen rather with the power sector, where as the government reacted to the crisis, they signed over 30 or so power purchase agreements, and the capacity charges on some of them range from 3 cents a kilowatt hour to well in excess of 5-7 cents a kilowatt hour, just to ensure that the plant was available. But most of them we actually didn't need, because we're going to have a huge excess supply in the market. And this is something we would have to still watch out for when it comes to the LNG sector, as we attempt to bridge the gap, going forward. The key policy considerations around LNG really is the price, how it's indexed and linked to our prices, the foreign exchange rates, the contract terms, where is it either take or pay, and then the levies and margins that we apply on the sector. This is very much like what happens in the downstream oil and gas sector with the pricing approach. But what I want to show here, if I just wrap up, is when you look at the domestic sources of gas that we've got, currently for the associated gas, which is gas that is free and available to the government, the price of that is just around $2.5 to $3 for every million British thermal units. With LNG, and if we wanted to use crude oil, this was done in 2013 by the World Bank. The prices have also come down significantly. But the big question is, how would all of this ultimately transmit into the price of the electricity tariffs that consumers pay? So with tariffs, we've seen the average tariff rates. This goes all the way back to 2006, but you can see the big component often has been the forex issue, and that has been one of the significant factors for the historical under-recoveries that we have seen in the sector. This also extends to the downstream, oil and gas sector, where seniors, I think you lead a group where, of course, you've been arguing with government over this particular issue of FX and then under-recoveries for some time. That's just the tariff structure. But 2 more slides and then I'll wrap up. One big policy initiative I have seen has been the launch of this ESLA bond to want to resolve the sector's historical indebtedness. So we're looking at the figure is about 2.3 billion, and out of that you can see about 800 million is actually money that's owed to the banks, and 440 of that is owed to various fuel suppliers. And with the launch of the bond and then subsequent use of the monies to settle this indebtedness, two things are likely to happen. One, which is, reduce the NPL loans portfolio within the banking sector, but then also, enhance the overall profitability of the off-takers within the energy market. Which brings me to the point on ECG, where are we looking at privatization being the answer to the persistent woes of ECG? This I took from my Journal 9's website, and I think it was a protest march organized by PWU, Public Utilities, PUWU, Workers Union, where they raised interesting points or questions around the privatization and the concession. But, are we looking at a scenario post-privatization? We'll probably see One Love and Mensa becoming, the face figures for ECG. That's a bit on the light side. But the point here is that there's this 20-year PSP agreement, which is backed by the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And at the core, it's to address the systemic issues that affect ECG. ECG cannot account for 25% of all power that it procures from the IPPs. If you look at that number in other established markets, the figure sometimes is below 5%. And the target is to actually move to below 5%. And to do that, it needs investment. But it also needs investment in revenue collection, reducing the commercial losses. But the nice thing that I saw in the PSP agreement, which became the subject of debate, was this 51% indigenous equity participation in the PSP agreement. To the extent that one of the private sector companies that wanted to bid to operate the concession pulled out on the basis of this 51% indigenization requirement in that. But I think overall, if we want to improve the power sector's sustainability, then we need to have a much more system-based approach fundamentally, where the automatic adjustment formula has to be rigorously applied, the age-old issue of subsidies dealt with, settling of the indebtedness. But another point I find interesting is it possible actually to have all the government buildings, move or become smart buildings? If I walk into the facility and you used it and you walked out, the lights should be able to go off automatically within 5 hours if it can. Sorry, within 5 minutes if it cannot, detect any human activity within that sector. But these little things, when you actually add them up, go a long way to ensure that we improve on the profitability of the sector. So I'll finish up with my take-home point on the power sector. We have to develop, or there is a need for an integrated sort of long-term energy roadmap, a master plan. We have a gas master plan. There's bits of document all over the place on the energy or the power master plan, but we've got to actually integrate all of these across the value chain, how upstream, midstream, downstream, and then the power sector all connect together. And that would have to then form the basis of government discussions going. And I know some work has been done on this. But within the sectoral framework in terms of policies, regarding the gas sector, we need critically to pass the Gas Act to give meaning to the master plan, the gas master plan that was passed in 2014. And by that, I mean practically defining the roles of the different sector agencies, how gas is priced, and the tariff methodology that we apply, including some of things around third-party access to infrastructure. These they're fairly technical, but it's work that needs to be done if we really want to get the gas sector integrated within the wider energy framework. Yes, we need a gas pricing policy and regulatory framework, in the sense that even with Jubilee, we discovered Jubilee 2007, started producing in 2010. The contract says that up to the first 200 billion cubic feet of gas, that's basically free, it goes to the government. But post the 200 BCF, we actually need to agree on a gas price that would pay for the gas that's processed at the wellhead. As I speak, that is still yet, it's a subject of debate, not debate, subject of discussion between the government and the IOCs. The framework that we pass in terms of gas pricing has to have the core principles of cost-reflective pricing that ensures that the financial viabilities of the different entities within the chain become and that ensures the financial viability of the different operating entities within the power or the gas to power value chain. The other point is on the enabling environment for renewable energy. Again, one of the things I have been pushing for is for us to actually move towards an auctions-based system for renewable energy. So currently the feed-in tariff policy that we have has not worked. And I showed you the fact that we had these beautiful plans 10 years ago. We wanted to get 10% of the energy mix being renewable by 2020. As we speak, it's less than 1%. And part of the reason really is that even in the presence of a feed-in tariff, which is way higher than the tariff that the thermal-based producers pay, the difference is about 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. It still has not translated into RE development. What other countries have done, and 2 examples I'll cite here, is Zambia and then South Africa. What they have done is actually get the different IPPs to actually come in and auction to deploy large-scale solar onto the grid, where you auction and compete on the basis of the power that is delivered. And it's been a huge success story in South Africa under the REIPP project, where because solar prices or solar modules are falling, some of the bids are coming in at about 3 cents a kilowatt hour for power that is delivered to the grid. And what that would do, even if we got that 10% component, would be that ultimately tariffs might actually, end up being, relatively much more cheaper for consumers. Different financial models. I talk about an innovation and a development fund for off-grid innovation that needs to be set up, and this would be to connect some of the communities, in the upper water regions where they still are not connected to the grid. I mentioned the fact that we've got 67% of the rural communities getting access to the grid, so we still have 30% really to go. And part of the way to do that would be potentially via an innovation and development fund. And I'll touch lastly on what some of the private sector initiatives that I have seen, which actually needs to be encouraged. So 2 companies I cite here, one being run by a friend of mine, Kobna, Translight Solar, and then another company in Kenya called M-Kopa. And what they're actually doing is moving from the mainstream to distributed on-site modular energy. And that allows communities or people at a lower income level to get access to electricity. And it's being deployed by using things like, the mobile infrastructure, and other payment solutions that we're seeing on the market. So there's quite a bit that also needs to be done here, and it's an opportunity for private sector sort of players to, get into the market. But that has to be done together with the policy initiatives that would ensure that this is actually looked at from a holistic, integrated point of view than any other. So bottom line, with all this long stuff that I've said is, yes, on the economy, we see the momentum being sustained, but if you really are looking at the robustness of the recovery over the next 10 years, then it will depend on the ability of whichever government of the day delivering on the oil and gas production targets, but then using those receipts that we get to grow the non-oil sectors of the economy. So that's developing the linkages. It's one big subject area of work that is that's being done. But we have to map out the opportunities for industrialization, and that ties into the value linkages where we identify clearly some of the niche areas that the private sector, together with the government, can actually favorably participate in. Yes, boost ECGs, revenue mobilization initiatives by the PSP agreement, but we still have to address the fundamental recurrent non-payment risk within the energy sector value chain. And I think at this point I'll probably pause and